Today, we're digging into a really compelling story, looking at what's inside specific excerpts from Jon Krakauer's book, Into the Wild. Our mission is to unpack the details, the different views, the facts presented just in these pages about this young man who went looking for something different up in Alaska.
Right, and what makes these pages work is how Krakauer pieces it all together. Notes, journal bits, memories from people Alex met. It builds this really complex image.
Yeah.
And we're going to stick just to what this text tells us, sort of exploring the picture it paints.
Okay, so where does the text actually kick things off? It's interesting. It starts near the end, almost, with a postcard.
Yeah.
It arrived April 27th, 1992, for Wayne Westerberg in South Dakota. The message: "Greetings from Fairbanks. This is the last you shall hear from me, Wayne.
Uh-huh.
I now walk into the wild. Alex." Pretty stark.
And the book tells us, just 2 days before that, a guy named Jim Gallion picked up a hitchhiker near Fairbanks, calls himself Alex. Gallion's description in the text is quite clear. Maybe 5'7", 5'8", wiry guy. Said he was 24, from South Dakota, wanted to ride towards Denali National Park. His plan: live off the land for a few months.
And the first thing Gallion noticed, the source really emphasizes this, was Alex's backpack. It seemed improbably light, that's the phrase used, for someone planning to be out there a long time, especially springtime in Alaska.
Exactly. And Gallion knew the woods, He's an experienced guy, so that discrepancy, that lightness, it really stood out to him. That's one of the first clues that text drops about maybe Alex wasn't fully prepared.
Right, and Krakauer includes Gallion's thoughts on this in his slow, sonorous drawl, as the book puts it.
Yeah, he talks about people from outside getting these romantic ideas from magazines.
Thinking, hey, I'm going to get on up there, live off the land.
But the reality is different. Gallion says, live in the bush isn't no picnic. He mentions the rivers, the mosquitoes.
Big rivers, fast rivers, mosquitoes eating you alive.
It's a real contrast the text sets up early on through Gallion's eyes. The dream versus the tough reality.
But Gallion didn't think Alex was, crazy or anything, despite the gear.
No, not at all. The text says he found him congenial, even well-educated.
Ask smart questions, right? About game, edible plants.
Thoughtful questions, yeah. But then there's this other detail from that ride, something the source plants early that becomes super important later.
What's that?
His fear of water. As they crossed the Nenana River Bridge, Alex mentioned it. Said he'd nearly drowned down in Mexico the year before.
Ah, okay. That definitely comes back. So where was he actually trying to get to?
He showed Gallion this crude map pointing to the Stampede Trail.
Marked as a dashed red line on the map, the text says.
In the description. Not well-traveled. It just kind of peters out in the middle of trackless wilderness north of Mount McKinley.
And the specific spot near where he ended up, that Wolf Townships area just outside the park.
The text calls it a local secret, known by hunters for having plenty of game.
So that's near the end of his journey, presented early. But then the book jumps back, right? Starts filling in the backstory.
Exactly. How did Alex Supertramp, get to that point?
A big moment the text highlights is him abandoning his car, that yellow Datsun near Lake Mead.
Yeah, quite dramatic.
And the book gives this really specific list of what was inside. A Gianni guitar, $4.93 in change, a football, clothes, fishing rod,
razor, harmonica, jumper cables, 25 pounds of rice, the keys still in the glove box.
And that note left on the windshield? This piece of shit has been abandoned. Whoever can get it out of here can have it.
But the text explains why he left it. It wasn't just trashed.
No.
A flash flood got the engine wet.
Right. He tried starting it, drained the battery.
And the floodwaters were blocking the way out anyway. He was basically stranded.
But the irony, which the source points out, is that the car wasn't actually ruined.
No. Rangers jump-started it easily later. It ran like a champ, the book says. They even used it for undercover drug busts.
Wow. So he chose to abandon it, rather than it being truly broken down.
Seems like it. A deliberate choice. Then the text takes us to South Dakota, Carthage.
Described as this sleepy little cluster, set adrift in time, tiny place, population 274.
And meeting Wayne Westerberg.
Westerberg's memory, according to the text, is that Alex was big-time hungry. Hungry, but real happy.
Yeah, the pages add that Alex admitted he hadn't eaten in a couple of days, had kind of run out of money.
And he told Westerberg about ditching the car.
And burning his cash. Said he didn't need money. That's a recurring theme the text explores, this rejection of convention.
He didn't want to stay with Westerberg at first, wanted to head to Saco Hot Springs.
But it rained, so he ended up crashing in Westerberg's trailer. A little glimpse of flexibility there, maybe?
Then earlier in his travels, the text mentions Willow Creek, California. He got a ticket for hitchhiking.
And this is key. The source calls it an uncharacteristic lapse. He gave his parents' real address in Annandale, Virginia.
Ah, so that's how the ticket eventually found its way back to them.
Exactly. And that's what prompted them to hire Peter Kalitka, the private investigator. Just that one slip-up connected the dots.
The book also talks about his time in Bullhead City, Arizona, describes it as a haphazard sprawl.
Of subdivisions and strip malls.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the source says he took a strong liking to it.
Why? The text speculates maybe an affinity for the lumpen, ordinary folks, or just the stark desert landscape.
Could be. And the details from his job there at McDonald's are pretty telling in the book.
Like what?
Well, he had this thing about socks. Refused to wear them when he wasn't on shift, even though it was against the rules.
Huh.
Worked slow, seemed off in his own universe.
Yeah.
But he was reliable, a body that showed up every day.
And didn't the manager have to talk to him about hygiene?
Uh-huh. The text includes that anecdote. An assistant manager had to tell him he needed to take a bath. Small details, but they paint a picture.
Then there's Jan Burrs and Bob down near the Salton Sea, living out at the slabs.
Right. Their impression, according to the text, he was a nice kid, seemed real happy.
Proud of living off plants he'd identified from a book.
Yeah, he camped with them for a week near Oric Beach. And the text mentions Tracy, that 17-year-old girl at the slabs.
Oh, yeah, she developed a crush on him.
A hopeless crush, the book says. And Alex. He was nice to her, but she was too young for him. He couldn't take her seriously.
Yeah.
Another instance noted in the text of him keeping emotional distance.
Which really comes through with Ron France in Salton City.
Definitely. The source includes that powerful letter McCandless wrote to friends,
urging him to make a radical change, get rid of monotonous security, embrace passion for adventure.
France got really attached, even asked to adopt Alex.
And Alex's response, as the text presents it, was awkward.
Yeah, uncomfortable. We'll talk about it when I get back from Alaska, Ron. Kind of brushed it off.
And Krakauer's interpretation in the text is pretty direct.
Very. It says McCandless was relieved that he had again evaded the impending threat of human intimacy, of friendship, and all the messy emotional baggage.
Wow, that's quite a statement about his mindset at the time.
And the text shows the devastating effect on Franz. Drinking whiskey out in the desert, hoping he'd die. Later moved his whole camp after a flood. It really underscores the impact Alex had and his own struggle with connection.
Okay, one more key encounter before Alaska, according to these pages. Gaylord Stuckey.
Right, picked him up at Liard River Hot Springs. Stuckey wasn't sure at first. Company rules against hitchhikers.
But Alex looked clean-cut, spoke well, so Stuckey gave him a ride.
And they spent 3 days together. The text says Alex actually opened up a bit more with Stuckey.
What did he say?
Stuckey called him a dandy kid, said he didn't swear, talked about his sister, Karine, admitted he didn't get along with his parents.
I mentioned the father stuff.
Yeah. Said his dad was a NASA rocket scientist, but also that he had been a bigamist at one time, and that kind of went against Alex's grain. So the text introduces this family complexity here.
Okay, so after all those encounters, the narrative in the book brings us back to Wayne Westerberg in Carthage.
Right. Alex shows up again in March, ready to work at the grain elevator.
Planning to stay until mid-April, the text says, to earn a grub stake. Money for supplies for the Alaska trip.
And this is interesting. The text notes McCandless needed to buy a pile of new gear.
But wait, didn't Gallion say his pack was super light just weeks later in Alaska?
Exactly. It's one of those apparent contradictions the source points out. What happened to that pile of gear? Did he buy it? Did he ditch it? The text leaves it a bit open.
He also promised Westerberg he'd come back for the fall harvest.
A promise he obviously couldn't keep. There's also that nice little story in the text about Wayne's mom, Mary Westerberg.
Oh, yeah, she invited Alex for dinner.
And they just clicked. Talked nonstop for 5 hours, the book says.
What was her take on him?
Mary's description, captured in the text, is that he seemed much older than 24. Very thoughtful, hungry to learn about things.
And committed, right.
Yeah. She said he insisted on living out his beliefs. Reinforces that picture of deep conviction.
And then came the final messages. The postcards.
The last communications. One from Whitefish, Montana, April 18th. Said he was making good time on a freight train, planning to jump the border into Canada soon, heading for Alaska.
Then the very last ones, April 27th from Fairbanks, sent to Wayne and also to Jan Burrs and Bob.
Pretty much the same message. This is the last communication you shall receive from me. I now walk out to live amongst the wild. And that was it.
So, cards sent, Goodbye said. The text then follows him onto the Stampede Trail.
Yeah, into the Alaskan interior, following a faint snow machine track at first.
And just 2 days in, he hits a major obstacle mentioned in the text.
The Teclanica River.
How was it then?
Thigh deep when he crossed. There'd been an early thaw, then a cold snap, so the water level was manageable, though still challenging.
But the source calls this crossing his Rubicon. Why?
Because the book explains that by summer, with all the glaciers and snow melting up high, that same river would swell up massively, like 9 or 10 times its volume.
So what was crossable just barely, maybe, in April?
Became completely impassable later on. A crucial detail.
And his destination on that trail. Fairbanks Bus 142.
Right, sitting there beside the Susquehanna River, just outside the main Denali Park boundary.
So he makes it to the bus. And the text gives us glimpses of his life there, mainly through his journal.
Yeah, those journal entries are key parts of the source material here.
One big event covered is him shooting a moose in June.
Right. The text includes entries about trying to preserve it, remove heart and other lung, haul near cave, try to protect with smoker. He was trying.
But it didn't work out.
No. The next entry calls it a disaster. It reads, maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Don't know. Looks like disaster.
And then that really poignant line.
I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies in my life. He had to abandon almost all the meat.
But the text notes he reflected on it later, writing something like,
henceforth will learn to accept my errors, however great they be. So the text portrays him as capable of seeing his mistakes, learning from them.
What else did the book find in the bus? His books, right?
Yes, and the passages he marked are really revealing, giving insight into his thoughts during that isolation.
Like from Tolstoy's Family Happiness.
He highlighted a line about how the only certain happiness in life is to live for others. Interesting, given his solitude.
And something from Dr. Zhivago?
Yeah, by Pasternak. A passage about love of neighbor, free personality, life as sacrifice. And in the margin, the text says he wrote, need for a purpose.
He also marked up stuff in Thoreau's Walden and Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata about chastity.
Chastity and moral purity, yeah. The text suggests he was wrestling with some deep philosophical and ethical questions out there, not just day-to-day survival.
And he kept trying to live off the land, gathering plants.
Including those wild potato roots, Hedysarum alpinum, which he identified using that book, Tanita plant lore. And this specific plant becomes critical to the book's explanation of what happened.
Because later, in July, the text says he tried to hike out.
He did. But when he got back to the Teclanica River,
it was totally different raging.
Completely impassable. And here, the source brings together a few key threads. His fear of water, which he'd mentioned to Galleon.
Right.
The real danger of the rapids in the gorge downstream. And crucially, the fact that his simple map didn't show a way across.
The text argues he didn't know about a cable crossing downstream.
Exactly. There was apparently a gauging station with a cable ferry set up not too far away, but without a detailed map, he wouldn't have known it existed. So facing that roaring river, the text suggests he concluded crossing was simply impossible.
His journal entry from that time, quoted in the text, sounds pretty desperate.
It does. Disaster, reined in, river look impossible, lonely, scared. He wrote that trying to cross would be suicidal. He was trapped.
So he goes back to the bus, and this is where the source really digs into the cause of death, that wild potato plant again.
H. alpinum, yeah. The text points to a journal entry from July 30th. Extremely weak. Fault of pot, seed. Krakauer emphasizes that last word, seed.
Okay, so what's the theory presented in the book?
Krakauer cites later research suggesting that while the roots of the wild potato are edible, the seeds might contain a toxic alkaloid, possibly swainsonine.
Something that prevents the body from metabolizing food properly.
Exactly. It essentially leads to starvation, even if you're eating.
And the argument in the text is that McCandless didn't confuse the plant with something else, like the poisonous wild sweet pea.
Right. Krakauer argues forcefully in these pages that McCandless knew he was eating wild potato. The plant lore book said the roots were fine, but crucially, it didn't warn about the seeds being potentially toxic.
So according to the source, it was an innocent error.
That's the phrase used, an error born of extreme hunger, maybe desperation, trying to get any calories he could from the plant, but an error sufficient to do him in. The text really leans into this specific explanation, poisoning by the seeds of H. alpinum.
And in the discovery, the book details how he was found.
Yeah, it's grim. September 6th, 1992. 3 moose hunters, Ken Thompson, Gordon Samuel, Ferdy Swanson, were out near the bus.
There were others there too, right? An Anchorage couple, another guy named Butch Killian.
Uh-huh. Gordon Samuel's account in the text is really vivid. He climbed on a stump, looked in a back window, saw a sleeping bag.
Shook it.
Yeah, shook it with a stick or something, realized there was definitely something in it, but it felt way too light. Then he saw a head sticking out.
Oh, man.
Chris McCandless. The text estimates he'd been dead for about 2.5 weeks by then.
How did they figure out who he was? The identification process described in the book sounds like putting pieces together.
It really was. Jim Gallion, the guy who gave him the ride, he saw a news story with a map Alex had shown him, recognized the details, called the State Troopers.
And Wayne Westerberg.
He heard a Paul Harvey radio broadcast about an unidentified hiker found dead in Alaska, suspected it might be Alex, and called the troopers too.
And Westerberg had crucial info, right?
He did. From the employment forms Alex filled out before leaving Carthage. Westerberg found the form signed Chris J. McCandless and provided the Social Security number. That was the breakthrough.
Which led the authorities to Virginia.
To Sam McCandless, Chris's older half-brother. They faxed in the photo. Sam's reaction, as told in the text, there was no doubt he was Chris. Dental records confirmed it later.
The text then shifts focus quite a bit to the family, their background, their grief. Walt McCandless.
Described as 56 at the time. Bearded, quiet, a big deal in SAR synthetic aperture radar technology for NASA. Even managed the first SAR satellite launch project.
The source gives some background on him?
Yeah, grew up poor, worked his way through college, plays piano. Notes he had a temper, but also that he became softer, more tolerant after Chris vanished. The text says Chris's disappearance scared and chastened him.
And Billy, Chris's mom.
Described as a tiny 48-year-old woman with girlish features. Her grief, as presented in the text, sounds absolutely overwhelming.
Not eating.
Believing she heard Chris calling, "Mom, help me," in the night. Just this profound sense of loss, questioning why he took those kinds of chances.
The text also emphasizes his relationship with his sister, Kimreen.
Yeah, younger sister. His closest friend, the book says, especially growing up. It shares little anecdotes building forts together. Him being protective.
Even a rivalry with the family dog, Buckley.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
Small details that show their bond.
But his relationship with his parents, the text calls it complex, full of apparent contradictions.
Right. He'd really rail against them to some friends, like Chris Gilmer mentioned in the text. But with his male buddies, he barely complained.
Resisted authority, instruction, like with that physics grade or racquetball lessons.
And the text pinpoints a specific source for a lot of his later anger towards them.
What was that?
When he visited relatives in El Segundo, California, after high school, he apparently discovered the full details of his father's previous marriage, the divorce, and how his own parents' relationship began overlapping with that.
Ah, the bigamy issue Stuckey mentioned.
Exactly. The text states this discovery fueled a smoldering anger that really damaged his relationship with Walt and Billy from then on.
Yet, the book also includes moments that complicate that picture, like his high school graduation party.
Yeah, he gave his dad a really expensive telescope, gave this emotional speech thanking them, acknowledging their differences.
So it wasn't all just anger.
Seems not. The source also notes his parents felt helpless. They had their hearts in their mouths the whole time he was gone, but there's no way to stop him.
There's also that detail about him bringing a machete and a rifle to his dorm room at Emory.
Contrasted in the text with his preppy roommate who ended up dropping out, while Chris, despite the weapons, made the dean's list. Another example the book uses to show him defying expectations.
And eventually the family visited the bus, Walt and Billy, and Carine too.
Yes, the text describes that pilgrimage. Billy finding silverware from their Annandale home inside the bus.
Smelling his old jeans.
Saying they still smell like Chris, and declaring he must have been very brave and very strong at the end, trying to find some meaning or solace there.
Walt installed a plaque, didn't he?
A brass plaque, yes. And Billy left a suitcase, first aid supplies, food, a Bible, and a note.
What did the note say?
Urged whoever found it to call your parents as soon as possible. Just heartbreaking. The text says Walt felt a little less baffled after the visit. Maybe not understanding, but perhaps a bit more at peace.
Towards the end, the book broadens the scope, right? Looks at other people who went into the wild.
Yeah, Krakauer offers these comparisons, these other stories, to give context to Chris's journey. It avoids making him seem totally unique or completely inexplicable.
Like Everett Roos.
Nemo, 1934, vanished in the Utah desert back in the 30s. The text points out similarities in their writing style that focus on freedom and simple beauty. Ruiz also changed his name, seemed kind of heedless about safety.
And Gene Rossellini, the guy who tried to live like a Stone Age man.
Right, his ambitious anthropological experiment in Alaska. He spent years at it, but eventually concluded modern humans have devolved, couldn't hack it. He later took his own life, the book notes.
Then John Malin Waterman, the climber.
Talented mountaineer, also from the D.C. area like McCandless, had a lot of personal tragedy, mental health struggles mentioned in the text, disappeared on Denali after seeming to deliberately head into a dangerous, crevassed area.
And Carl McCunn, the photographer, his story is just tragic incompetence, according to the text.
Yeah, he arranged to be flown into the Brooks Range, but neglected to arrange for the pilot to fly him back out. Just forgot.
The book describes him as a little bit dreamy, a little bit out of touch with reality, having unrealistic expectations.
These stories, presented in the text, show a spectrum of motivations, preparations, and outcomes for people drawn to the wilderness. Krakauer uses them to explore the different facets of that impulse.
He even includes his own story, climbing the Devil's Thumb in Alaska.
He does. Writes about that intense focus, escaping the clutter of day-to-day existence. Had a revelation about his own anger towards his father fading away up there.
But he doesn't glorify it. There's that quote in the text where he reflects.
Right, he says something like Chris McCandless, I was a raw youth who mistook passion for insight. I thought climbing the Devil's Thumb would fix all that was wrong with my life. In the end, of course, it changed almost nothing. It's a dose of self-aware realism.
And finally, there's that perspective from Roman Dial, the Alaskan adventurer.
Yeah, Roman, quoted in the text, says he didn't see a great deal of difference between his own climbs and McCandless's journey, except that McCandless died.
And suggests maybe the harsh critics see too much of themselves in Chris.
See too much of their former selves, yeah. It's a thought-provoking point the text leaves us with.
So quite a journey we've taken, just by following the trail laid out in these specific pages of the book. From Alex's arrival in Alaska, that final postcard, looping back through the people he met, the choices he made.
Yeah, all the way to the bus, the struggles described in his journal, the river crossing, the theory about the potato seeds.
And the impact on his family, the comparisons to others, all drawn directly from how this text presents the story.
Key elements highlighted in these pages. That search for freedom, the reality check of the wild, those complicated family dynamics, how different people saw him, and especially the book's specific analysis of his death.
When you look back at just these accounts from the book, what really jumps out? What does this specific telling reveal about, independence, nature's harshness, this search for meaning?
Well, the text itself brings up those old paper monks, the Irish monks who sail west, seeking something spiritual, driven by a hunger of the spirit. The beggars the modern imagination. Maybe the question these pages leave us with is, what does this particular story, told this way, suggest about how far people will go to find whatever it is they're looking for? Connection with nature, with themselves, something bigger. That's something the source material really makes you ponder.